His name was David Harlow, but everyone called him the Professor. I saw him in the hallways every day. He ritually went out for his morning walk around the time I'd be in the landlord's office opposite the lobby. He always gave a nod and waved as he passed. I'd known him my whole life. But as they say, how well do you really know someone? I'd taken over the building from my father a decade ago, as he had with his own father. I'd just finished college, but had zero job prospects, and then Dad got sick. So I stepped up. The property was a large, beautiful pre-war build that housed over a dozen large apartments across 4 floors. When the keys were handed over, I was given the whole shakedown, including the history of the place, its blueprints, everything I hadn't been privy to while growing up within its walls. And like all apartment buildings, this one had decades of secrets. But this one had a secret built into it. In the top corner penthouse, there was a trick wall that led to a walking crawl space guiding you to a hidden room. The tenant for the apartment was the Professor, and since I came across the information, I'd always wondered if he knew about it. I'd never known him well, but he knew my family. He'd been there since my grandfather had owned the building. What I did know about David was he'd been a professor of physics, math, and other hard sciences. He held multiple doctorates and PhDs in varying subjects. He was long since retired, though, and spent most of his time shuffling in and out of his apartment, carrying books that looked as ancient as he did. I always offered to help, of course, but he'd refuse politely. I'd catch him having conversations with himself in the hallways, like he was constantly figuring out complex problems in his head, though sometimes he came across as schizophrenic or borderline. I guess when you have a mind that moves that fast, consistently and complexly, day-to-day interactions must seem absolutely frivolous. Even with someone like me, who, despite carrying the title of landlord, had always found physics and mathematics fascinating and studied them as far as my cognitive abilities allowed. There just never seemed to be an inroad on chatting with him about any of it. Still, he was always pleasant, and rent methodically arrived 2 days early. The last few days, though, things had changed. I'd only see or hear him at night, coming and going, always around the same time, 3 a.m. He appeared more paranoid than usual, even asking if he could look at our security footage of the front entrance exterior. I brought him into the office and let him see the dates he was asking about. He didn't give any context or details of what or who he was looking for. When he was finished, he thanked me, and then he was off. I went back over the footage, but the only thing I could find was a white van that appeared and reappeared across the street, which could have been for anything. I was starting to get worried about the Professor. What if he was developing dementia, or suffering from it already? He had no friends or family I knew of. Maybe I should check in on him some more, or try to have longer, more positive interactions. Unfortunately, I never got the chance. The first of the month came and the Professor's rent still hadn't been dropped off. In fact, I hadn't seen him in several days. I made the long trek up to the 4th floor. The Professor wasn't answering my knocks, so I let myself in with a master key. The smell hit me immediately, and I found the Professor on the floor of the kitchen, dead. I called an ambulance, and paramedics arrived shortly later, pronouncing him dead and stating the cause of death appeared to be a heart attack. He looked to have been dead for at least 3 days. As I walked them out, I saw that our street now had a half-dozen white vans out front, and several black Lincolns, all of which had men in black suits exiting them. They looked government. 3 of the men approached me, asking if I was Jack Finch, the landlord. They told me they were representatives of the Harlow family and would need access to his apartment immediately. I told them I'd known him my whole life and wasn't aware he had any family. They said that was of no concern to me, but they would be entering, with or without my consent. And with that, 2 large unmarked moving trucks turned onto the street. Harlow's body was packed into the ambulance, and as the paramedics drove off, one of the vans and 3 of the Lincolns followed closely behind. I spent the rest of the night watching the men in black suits emptying out the Professor's apartment. They moved quickly and quietly. So quietly, in fact, I didn't hear a single complaint from any tenants. In the morning, the Lincolns and the moving trucks had gone, and almost all the vans had left. Almost. One remained out front across the street. I called the hospital before lunch to speak to someone about the delivery of the professor's body and what arrangements were being made, but the administrators had no records of an arrival. There was only one call out to our area last night, and the paramedics responding had reported it as a prank. I wanted to know what was going on, and took down the license plate of the van out front. One of our tenants was a police officer, so I asked if he could look into it. An hour later, he called me back. I was right, the van had government plates. High level. The tenant police officer couldn't even tell me which branch, but did say I should keep my head down, which is something I've always had a hard time with. Everything about last night was so secretive and rushed. Was the professor onto something the government wanted to know about? A conspiracy? Theories? Some kind of algorithm? I knew I'd never find out, because they took all his stuff. His apartment was empty of everything, including the light bulbs. It smelled like they bleached the floors, ceiling, and walls as well. Then I remembered the hidden room. Had the professor known about it? I guess now was my chance to find out. I waited until that night. The government van was still out front, so when I entered the apartment, I kept my flashlight low. I moved to the back bedroom of the penthouse where the trick wall was. I shifted it, backwards and up, just like my father had explained all those years ago. The panel shifted, and I pushed it open and stepped inside. I closed it behind me and flicked a makeshift light switch on the wall. The crawl space pathway lit up, and I could see the hidden room from where I was standing. I was nervous about what I might find, but the first glance inside eased my nerves. The room was filled, top to bottom, with all manners of study, untouched. I guess the government agents hadn't found it. I made my way into the workplace and was overwhelmed with the amount of books and information contained within the shelves and walls. Everything from philosophy and theology to linguistics, mathematics, quantum computing, and so much more. There was a desk covered in scattered notes and diagrams. Resting on top of all of them was a thick, leather-bound journal. I don't know what came over me, but before I knew it, I'd picked it up. Then, I heard the front door of the apartment shut. I froze. Footsteps creaked through the living room. Shit, the light. What if they see it under the crack in the wall panel? I quietly moved back through the pathway and to the light switch. I snapped it off, my whole body tensed in the darkness, listening for more movement. I could hear two sets of footsteps and muffled voices in discussion. They moved into the bedroom, and I felt a pit in my stomach. I shouldn't be nervous. This was my place after all. So why was I? I own the whole damn building. I should just march out there and ask who the hell was in my place. But I didn't. I crouched in the darkness of the crawlspace hallway and waited for the two sets of feet to leave the apartment. The door shut behind them, and I waited another 10 minutes, just to be sure. Then I snuck back out the trick wall and through the professor's place. I was nervous there'd be someone or someones in the hallway outside the room, but it was empty and quiet, as was the staircase back down to my apartment. I kept the lights off when I entered. Once I'd closed and triple-locked my door, I went into my study to go over the professor's journal I'd taken. I wasn't proud I'd nabbed it, but I was curious. And what could it hurt now? The journal was the size of a telephone book. There were vast pages filled with abstract and linear algebra, dipping and weaving through topography, cryptography, manifold theories, and tensor calculus. It was beyond comprehension. Diagrams and equations of electromagnetism and gravitational potentials. I was lost quickly, but found there were portions of the journal that slid back into the comprehensible, somewhat sane man I'd shared so many good mornings with in the hallway. It was as if the professor would spend days solving these expansive problems across dozens of pages, then only an afternoon discussing them in a brief breath of sanity for a page or two. The farther into the journal I went, the less confident I was, separating whether these were the ramblings of a madman or someone who knew things that would drive a sane man mad. And then there were the drawings. Incredibly detailed sketches of horrors that could only be conjured in the mind of a psychopath. Gargantuan monstrosities of gross violations of biology and physics in squirming masses, reaching and snapping forward to feed. Abominations that, if witnessed arising from the oceans, would cause mass deaths from mere sight alone. If these things, these impossible creations, could manifest forth into our reality, then our placement in the cosmos has been grossly exaggerated. Simply looking at the drawings, it felt like their hold on me grew stronger, and heat flashes moved in waves across my body. I had to put the journal down. It was getting to me. I went to the window and lit a cigarette. The van was still there. The book was feeling more and more dangerous the longer I had it. But my mind kept wanting to know more. Where was it all going? It was past midnight now, and after trying to sleep, I realized there was no use. I got up, poured a whiskey, and cracked the journal again. It opened to a long series of more drawings, graphic images of the seas rising. Mass chaos as biblical storms overtook cities and towns. Portals in the oceans opened to allow mass transit of those disturbing creatures into our world. Those abominations of science. Horrors with massive tusks sprouting from their mouths. No, not tusks. Tentacles. Writhing around kraken-like, but attached to mountainous organisms filled with teeth and the bodies of dragons. Reaching, grabbing, gnashing. There were explanations, even brief philosophies, explaining the entities, how they would overtake and destroy us easily. But they themselves were not evil creatures. They were simply beyond our understanding of advanced levels of ethics and morality, not unlike how we might view a mosquito, or how they might view us. I skimmed towards the end. There was a large piece of tracing paper that had been folded down several times and slid into the last pages. I unfolded it to see something that resembled the roots of a tree, or maybe it was the branch of a tree. Or our circulatory system? Stemming from the bottom of the paper, lines forked off outwards, spreading and covering the entire sheet. Each line had an X marked on the tip and was scribbled out as if it came to a dead end. But one line had a large O at the end of its path. The words Tuscan's Gate were sketched above it. And just further than the circle, unattached to any of the branching lines, was a triangle. It was labeled with the Sarkathian Ridge. I folded the sheet back up, thinking about coming back to it later. The last entry was from 4 days ago, and began with 2 words written down. The first word had 22 letters in it, and the second had 32. Each word had an entire page dedicated to it, detailing every aspect of it. Half of the page was giving a point-by-point breakdown of the pronunciation of every part of every letter used, and how they blended into one another. The words, separately, were incredibly difficult to say on their own, even while taking my time and sounding them out. But to properly enunciate them in 2 distinguishable but fluid structures seemed impossible. Still, I read on. At the bottom of one of the pages, the professor had written that the 2 words loosely translated to our world and their world. I took out the tracing paper again. I laid the sheet out on the floor and walked around it, eyeing from different angles. Then it hit me. I grabbed a city map from my cupboard and laid the tracing paper over it. The streets, subways, electrical lines, everything on the map synced up with one of the varying sizes of branching threads on the tracing paper. I looked to the single line that ended at Tuscan's Gate and found it to be just along the seawall. The Sarkathian Ridge looked to be a mile out from the shore, directly in front of the gate. If it wasn't for the new building being put up across the street, I'd be able to see the location of the gate, whatever that was, from the professor's window. The final page explained something deeply unsettling. Those creatures, those bastards of science, were mobilizing to attack our world, our dimension. They would use the Earth's own electromagnetic field to send out an EMP from the Sarkathian Ridge, which would have an immediate global effect, taking out communications and all electricity and battery-powered equipment. Then the storms would start. The seas would rise and then recede. A fog would roll in. And with the fog, the creatures. The ridge, located on tectonic fault lines that it shared with a gate, overlooked a vast series of geothermal vents and was a semi-open chasm between dimensions that could be used to enter ours. It appeared the creatures were slowly discovering how to pass through. If and when they did, the human race would fall within days, only to become a footnote, or less, in the antiquity of the cosmos. From the gate and under specific circumstances, it was possible to witness the mass assembly of grotesqueries nearing the ridge on their own plane, by going there physically. And the professor had figured out how. It could be accessed only at a certain time on our plane of existence, 3:47 a.m. That was when the barrier between our world and theirs was at its thinnest. We shared temporal space with them in an invisible dimensional overlap. But there, time folded in on itself. As in, there was no time. Eons could pass there, while we remained stuck between seconds here. The professor had visited and seen it. He came back a changed, disturbed man, with no hope for humanity. The last line of the journal was written in fear. I tried to stop it, but our last gasp is coming. And that was it. A few blank pages, and there was the back cover. I went over the final line a few times, and I hoped to God I was reading the ramblings of a loon. A manic genius with crisscrossed wires and a chilling imagination. But it just didn't feel that way. I went back through the journal to those two words, the ones that represented our world, and theirs. I tried to pronounce them again, but they contained multiple vowels in a row and came out like butchered tongue twisters. I looked at the time. It was 3 a.m. I was so uneasy because everything felt so uncertain. These writings might be complete insanity. But the professor did die, and government agents did come and clean out his apartment. And somehow, they did manage to erase his ambulance pickup and clear the records of it. And there was still one of the vans out front. I wrote down the lengthy words and slipped them in my pocket, deciding that the only way to know for certain was to do what the professor had done. He'd gone to Tuscan's Gate at the time he wrote down, and spoke the word that called forth the dimension of the cursed monstrosities. If they were real, if their world was true, I would do the same and see for myself. At least then I would know. I locked the journal in my safe, although I'm sure if the government officials down below me knew I had it, that wouldn't protect it. I snuck down the service stairs and out through a hole in the back fence. I used the alleyway and side streets to make my way down to the seawall. I arrived at the seawall, as close to the placement on the map as I could distinguish. The sky was clear, and the stars were out. It was a beautiful night. It was also 3:30, so I had 17 minutes to figure out how to pronounce the words. I pulled out the paper and started with the one that translated to their world. It was the shorter of the two words, but that only made it the second longest word I'd ever seen. I started pronouncing it slowly, developing into a rhythm, like a string of lyrics no longer separated by pauses. I spoke it again and again. The flow was getting better, and I started to feel it out more, discovering the alternating stress patterns of the words. It was 3:46. I took a deep breath and looked out over the water. Somewhere out there was the Sarkathian Ridge, a mile under the surface, waiting to be opened up. Maybe I was just a bored, lonely landlord in need of excitement, even of the false variety. 3:47. I began reciting the word again. The flow resumed, and I felt an odd tingling in my vocal cords. The street lamps around me began to dim and flicker. The tide down below picked up, slamming into the seawall, then receding. I spoke it one more time, and a bluster of freezing air slapped my body. The sky had changed. The water had changed. Everything had changed. The buildings behind me were gone. The cars, roads, even the seawall. I was standing on a rocky embankment, going through an absolute sensory overload. Everything was overwhelming. The smell was wretched and brought up images of disemboweled sea creatures rotting in dead-of-summer dumpsters. The roars of huge, bellowing miscreations were blowing out my eardrums and shaking my skull and the ground below me. Every breath I took in, I felt tiny ice crystals sharply cutting into my lungs. My eyes stung from the spray of the acidic seawater mist. But none of that could compare to what I was staring at. A never-ending cloud formation was building over the water, right where the ridge was likely to be. A massive electrical storm was surging through the clouds, sending blinding bolts of lightning deep into the ocean. A whirlpool was spinning below the screaming tempest. All of it welcoming the mass migration of the population of this dimension. The creatures, there were millions of them, farther than I could see, in sizes ranging from small rodents to beings the size of skyscrapers, more horrid and unimaginable than the drawings could dare capture. They emitted a hideous energy about them that felt like some kind of radiation attacking my skin, even from the far distance away that I was. I'd seen enough. I turned back to the paper with the words, but I found it getting soggy. Shit. I held it close, blocking it from the pouring, partially acidic rain that was beginning to eat it away. I started reading the first word out loud, the longer one, the one that translates to our world. I'd found the groove of the language, whatever language it was written in, for that first word, and was hoping the technical skill would translate to this one. But nothing was changing. I was still here, and what was worse, the creatures had noticed me. Some of them were turning back away from the ridge and approaching me with frightening interest. I said the word again and again and again and again, but nothing. The creatures were getting closer. One of the smaller ones, roughly the size of a horse, but with many more legs and 6 sets of jaws, was sprinting towards me. mouths snapping, and piercing shrieks emerging from its vocal cords. My mouth kept spitting out the word, singing it and saying it differently each time, but it wouldn't work. I turned around and saw one of the creatures had come up from the water and was inches from my face. It was covered in tentacles, massing and thrashing about, looking for something to pull into its cavernous mouth. Its jaws opened, and I saw deep into its throat, down into its stomach. It was constantly changing, expanding inwardly and outwardly simultaneously. Faces and mouths and teeth appearing and disappearing as they festered upward from the stomach. I knew the mere sight had caused a switch to go off in my brain, and any sanity I was clinging to had left me. I would never be the same, even if I was to survive this. As the creature's maw was about to close over my head, I managed to sputter out the word once more in a succinct, flowing vocalization. The assault on my senses disappeared. I was laying on the hard cement of the seawall bike path again. I was back in our world. The paper was still in my hand, but it was pretty much eaten away. I didn't care. I let it fall over the edge and into the water. The walk back to my building was strained. I didn't feel right. My lungs hurt, and so did my chest. My body felt like I'd run several marathons in a row. I made it inside through the back entrance, but knew I wasn't making it to my apartment. I stopped at a tenant's, who was the cop I got help from earlier, and I got him to take me right to the hospital. On the drive there, I felt a striking pain in my chest. It streaked through my left arm, and I realized I was having a heart attack. We managed to get to the hospital in time, and after a week of operations and 3 weeks of rest, I was released. The journal was still in my safe. I decided it was too dangerous to have, and replaced it back upstairs in the professor's hidden room. I had a serious conversation with myself about burning it, page by page, but decided maybe, someday in the future, the information contained in it would be of use to someone. Until that day, I'll be keeping my eyes on the seawall and watching for the tide to rise and then recede.